Starting on page 450, we have a new section about audience design. Now, audience design is this practice of adjusting parts of what we're saying so that people can understand it better. It's a principle that is philosophically possible, but as we read through this section, we find that really people don't participate in audience design an awful lot. Here are some pieces of evidence that suggest that. On page 451, we see figure 11.10. This figure is some possible stimuli from an experiment where in panel A there were two pictures of a bat, and there was experimental participant supposed to give instructions to another either confederate or an experimental participant or something like that. And in order to make clear which bat was being talked about, they would have to say, like, the large bat or the small bat. In the linguistic ambiguity condition, that's panel B, there are two bats, but one is of the hitting variety and one is of the flying variety. So when giving instructions, in order to be clear about which bat you mean, you would have to specify, for instance, the flying bat. And in the third condition, it's a control condition, there was no ambiguity. The participants didn't have to specify any particular type of bat, because there was only one. So when comparing across these conditions, the researchers found that 65% of the time, when there was no ambiguity in that third condition, the participants just said the bat. That's just how they said it. I guess it seems like then the other 35% of the time they must have said something more specific, maybe like the animal bat, the flying bat, something like that. But when we compare that to the other two conditions, we see that let's start with the non-linguistic ambiguity in panel A. If there was two pictures of bats, of animal flying bats, they failed to differentiate between those two bats only 1% of the time. So that suggests that these participants have really good awareness of the fact that those need to be distinguished from each other. But when there's a situation of linguistic ambiguity, when the fact that there's two pictures of a bat but that they have the same name but they're not the same thing, then all of a sudden participants were failing 40% of the time. So sure, when you compare it to when you compare it to the no ambiguity condition, the control, it dropped from 65%. So participants were doing better at being disambiguating, right? They put more specific words describing the flying bat than they would have ordinarily. Maybe 15% of the time more, like they did it maybe 15% of the time more often, right? But if you compare that to the non-linguistic ambiguity condition, then that's an abysmal failure. There's 1% versus 40% of failures. That suggests that participants weren't considering very often the needs of the recipient of the communication. The fact that the recipient might be confused at the potential ambiguity between the picture of a baseball bat and a flying bat. We see further evidence of the difficulties that people have in being clear and unambiguous in box 11.5. We see here that speakers actually don't consider the needs of their hearers when they're mumbling. Rather, they consider they consider just the needs of themselves as a speaker. They're very egocentric in considering the needs of the situation, and in order to get out the right words, they do whatever they need to be able to speak in a way that makes sense to them, regardless of whether it makes sense to the hearer. The evidence suggesting this is that there's a natural juxtaposition between the needs of the hearer and the needs of the listener in one particular case, in the case of words of a dense phonological neighborhood. So these are words like cap or cat that are very phonologically similar, but they're accessed and processed in different ways. So if you were accessing them as a speaker, you access them semantically. If you are processing them as a hearer, you process them phonologically. So I am accessing the details of a cap as a speaker, and I will access them via things like worn on head, has a bill, stuff like that. And an individual processing would combine the sounds k, ap. They would not play any of the semantic components of the concept wouldn't play much of a role in the initial processing of the sounds. So, because these different ways of processing are in competition to each other, we can see which method do people generally use when they're trying to communicate. Do they consider the difficulties in processing for somebody who's hearing when they're speaking? And so far the research suggests no, not really. Another piece of evidence that suggests the same thing is if we move over to page 454, then we have different ways of phrasing a garden path sentence so that it can be ambiguous or not ambiguous. And these are detailed in the table there. 11.2. The ambiguous framing puts the garden path sentence in such a way that it sounds like originally Grant's letters were given to Lincoln. So the Foundation gave Grant's letters to Lincoln. But what really we realize as soon as we continue the sentence is that really those are Grant's letter to Lincoln is a noun phrase, and that they're being given to a museum in Philadelphia. An unambiguous way to say that same thing would be the Foundation gave a museum in Philadelphia Grant's letters to Lincoln. All of a sudden, there's no confusion about which sentence is clear, and yet we find that people are not inclined necessarily to give the unambiguous version. Another piece of evidence that we see in favor of this is on page 455. There are words that can be added to a reduced relative clause so that it becomes just an ordinary relative clause. For instance, that or who. And if we have a garden path sentence that could be ambiguous without that word, in other words, if we have an ambiguous sentence that is a garden path sentence because of a reduced relative clause, then we have a choice in recalling, in retrieving during a memory task these garden path sentences. We have a choice. We have a choice to produce the sentences in a way that includes the word that, or that doesn't include the word that. And really, what researchers are getting at here is implicitly, without thinking consciously about it, are people more likely to insert the word that if it seems like it might be confusing? And the research suggests that no, not really. People are inclined to do what's easiest to produce. So if there's some taxing, if there's some, how do I say this? If keeping some material in working memory is particularly tasking, then the research participants are likely to spit out the pronoun from working memory to get it out of the way so that they can continue to work with the remainder of the sentence. And they ignore the word that, and they just try to spit out the material as quickly as they can, and consider not at all the needs of the listener in understanding ambiguous sentences that could be clarified by using the word that or who. So those are some various studies that suggest that on the whole, people are really crummy at considering the needs of their audience, that mostly they just consider the needs that they have themselves while they're producing language.